Well, Zach, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm excited about this. Your extensive knowledge and experience in housing is I bow down to all the things that you're doing and accomplishing and the network that you are bringing in. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure, thanks, David. Hey, everyone. Good to see some faces and new names. Um, yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation and hearing from you all. My name's Zach. Uh, I am the coalition director for the California Green New Deal Coalition, which I'll share a little bit more about as we kind of get into things. We organize with a lot of environmental justice groups and communities across the state, in addition to a number of other community-based grassroots organizations, but also have sort of a much larger kind of big tent coalition of a broad range of different groups and organizations, sort of volunteer, nonprofit, you name it, groups working across the state on sort of a shared political agenda that I'll talk more about. Um, yeah, and so I always really value the opportunity to meet with different people and kind of talk a little bit about what we're doing and like hear different perspectives, how things are showing up in your lives, how you sort of see and understand different policy and political discussions moving in California. I'm going to talk today about some campaigns that we're working on related to housing, and specifically this idea that we have a campaign around for green social housing. This is sort of an emerging and growing sort of movement and demand that communities are making across the country. And in California is a model that many folks in other parts of the world are more familiar with. So I'll talk a little bit about, but it's sort of new and novel to a lot of people here. So we'll do my best in sort of a short period of time to talk through this, but I'm very much looking forward to kind of discussion and conversation about it. So I have some slides in case that's helpful for visual learners out there. And I think I'll be relatively brief, probably like 10 minutes, but people should definitely put questions in the chat or things, thoughts as we go, and I think can get to those pretty shortly. Okay. Um, so yeah, as I mentioned, uh, California Green New Deal Coalition, the way that the coalition is structured is we have a steering committee just so you sort of like are grounded in who this coalition is. You may or may not know these organizations, but are a sort of broad range of different environmental justice and other kind of identity and community-based organizations from across the state. This is sort of the leadership of the coalition that help make a lot of the strategic decisions. And then, as I said, beyond that, there's this like much broader coalition of organizations and coalition members that help to move the campaigns of the coalition forward. Our DNA, as the name sort of implies, is really growing out of this vision for a Green New Deal, which sort of gained momentum and kind of national attention in kind of 2018, 2019. This coalition came together to try to advance that vision in California. Again, that concept means a lot of different things to people. For us, at a baseline, I think is just sort of trying to think about how we simultaneously address climate, economic, and racial justice issues all together, really thinking about root cause sort of systems change work, and also really being a coalition. Sometimes we sort of talk about it as like a yes coalition, like what are we saying yes to, not just like what are the things we are saying no to. The coalition in working on a broad range of sort of equitable climate investments over the past 2 years have really focused on this intersection of climate and housing work. And again, as I mentioned, specifically this campaign and demand for green social housing, which I'll talk about. Just to open things up, and sometimes I think people previously, like some of these connections are less familiar to people, but I think especially now in California, we like know all too well the ways that the housing and climate crisis like are literally fueling each other. We have wildfires consuming homes and entire communities. At the same time, we also know that buildings and homes are like are very significant contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. So literally like fueling the kind of climate disasters that are then in turn destroying our homes and communities. We also know that there's sort of accompanied with a cost of living crisis, and in the world of housing, that results in extremely high rents, extremely high rates of eviction, and increasingly things like home ownership out of the grasp of many people. So, yeah, I think this is like very familiar to many of us. I would imagine many of you have been personally impacted, or your family's impacted by this, whether it's through rent burden or actually experiences of extreme climate impacts um, in the places you live. When we talk about this, like especially with community members in our community bases, often it sort of starts with this question, which is like in some ways very straightforward, like what is housing, or sort of what does housing mean to you? And I think, this all evokes both like an understanding of like the buildings of our homes, but also like I think the symbolic meanings of what home is fundamentally as like a place of shelter, but also a place of belonging and safety, and is the place that we like raise our families and we go and spend much of our time. I think the thing that a lot of people maybe are somewhat aware of, but usually don't think of first, is thinking of housing as um, a thing that they use for profit or for as a commodity. That people do think about housing as, a wealth building opportunity, especially generationally, and that's been how it's used. But it's not sort of the first thing that we think about. And this sort of leads to this question of, what is the root cause of the housing crisis in California? I think that's actually like a very big and complicated question that has a lot of different ways that we can sort of go into thinking about it. But as we get into this conversation of social housing, I think this really sort of identifies at very least like one sort of key aspect of understanding the sort of our analysis of what is happening around the housing crisis here, which is to say that increasingly um, housing speculation and financialization, specifically in the rental market, is driving rents higher, even as we're producing more market rate housing. And this is fundamentally because we treat housing primarily as a commodity, which is to say an asset that is bought and sold for profit, rather than as a human right. So I think there's a lot of different things that are going on here, and a lot of conversations around the state, around the production of housing, the sort of supply and demand arguments. Also, a lot of things that people say about regulating the housing market in terms of rental protections, tenant protections, things like that. But fundamentally, I think it's helpful to first and foremost understand that in thinking about our housing system, we use a market to sort of really understand who has access and can afford to pay for housing, which is to say, treating housing as a commodity. That is how it's sort of developed and understood in the housing system that we have. Really, on the sort of solution side of that, this campaign for social housing is really about creating a system of decommodified housing that is outside of the market, which means really providing affordable housing as a public good. So we'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, about kind of like what the definition of green social housing is, or at least sort of our understanding of a definition. But I think by sometimes narrowing in on definitions of certain models of housing, people sort of think about like the building or the unit of housing and like what the characteristics of that building might be. Because I think, again, that's how we understand our own homes and housing generally. But I think really the push here is to think about systemically what is our system of housing and how do we start to intervene structurally on that system. When we talk about green social housing, this is, again, sort of a contested concept, and people have different ideas and associations of what comes to mind. Within our coalition and the work that we do, we understand it as having kind of four main pillars or principles. One is housing that is permanently affordable. And we mean affordability, not just in terms of what like other people in your community might make. Often what's used to determine affordability is something called area median income, which is like the average income of the broader region you live in. But that doesn't mean that that's actually what you can afford. And so you have actually a case where a lot of people who live in so-called affordable housing are still rent burdened because they can't actually afford, the affordable housing unit that they live in. I think the permanent affordability there is also a really important aspect. A lot of other affordable housing actually sort of expires in terms of the requirements to remain affordable. And so what we see right now is a lot of affordable housing that was built 30 years ago is now actually being actively sort of transitioned into market rate housing. And we're sort of losing affordable units sometimes at, as the same rate that we're producing them. Another really key piece, as I mentioned, is this idea of decommodification, which means that it's not produced or owned to maximize profits. It's primarily either owned by the public or by the community and produced to meet a human need. There's a range of different models that this sort of could take on, everything from things like community land trusts to things like housing cooperatives, other things like publicly owned and financed housing as well. Resident control is another really key component to this, which is really, I think, foreign to a lot of us in the United States, where the idea of like renters having some level of control of their housing is very like against the paradigm. Within social housing, more broadly, there's a really important pillar around sort of empowering residents, if they'd like to play an active role in sort of managing and governing the housing that they live in. And the last component, which was really important for us, is this component concept of housing being green and healthy, which means they are decarbonized without dirty fossil fuels, close to services and transit, and built on safe and climate resilient sites. So here, this sort of gives a sketch of the kind of things, sort of components of what, again, sort of social housing units would look like. But I think it's also helpful to understand this as like a model that does not exist, is sort of in our imagination, but is like literally happens in other parts of the world. Most commonly, people look to Vienna as a great model of this. There's a bunch of really good articles about this, but in Vienna, over half of the population live in social housing. And many that's been rated for many years as the best city to live in the world. They have extremely affordable rents and a whole range of this sort of emerging social housing sector. People might have seen there's a new report and then write up in NPR talking about how they're able to kind of leverage social housing to really advance their climate policies because they have this sort of like wide array of like publicly owned housing that then they're able to kind of like directly use to advance their climate and environmental and sustainability goals. In California, we've been advocating around this sort of concept that people have been pushing for this for the past sort of 7 years, but in 2023, there was a bill that was passed, Senate Bill 555, called the Stable Affordable Housing Act, that is actually the first ever state level social housing legislation in the United States. Did sort of two main things. One is defining social housing in state law. The second is requiring the state to conduct a study of how social housing at scale could really help respond to the housing crisis we face at the state level. So this study is ongoing, and now is actually the sort of very sort of important window, which is a great chance for me to be talking with you all. I'll get to that in just a moment. I think a sort of like a summary here and then call to action. Um, I think our general perspective is not to say, I mean, this campaign is not about like banning home ownership or saying like all landlords are evil or I think fundamentally it's trying to think about the system of housing and saying systemically, if we have an entire system that's built on a housing market based on private profit, that is never going to prioritize providing housing as a human right for everyone. Markets are good at a lot of things, um, but are generally, as they're wont to do, inequitably distribute the access of whatever resource they're applied to. And housing as a basic human need is not something we think should be left to market logic. Part of that is to provide this alternative that really makes sure that we provide housing as a human right for everyone. Fundamentally, this is about trying to address the affordable housing crisis while at the same time thinking about how our homes can be proactive solutions to our climate agenda as well. So right now, as I said, the state is conducting this study around social housing and is currently accepting public comment to inform this. We're really trying to get the word out around this. I can pop some links in the chat to the public comment as well as some sort of fact sheets that we've been working on with some of our partners to kind of help shape what this means. Um, but I think it's really an important opportunity for people to like talk about their own experiences with either housing insecurity or what they would like to see happen in California to take a more um, proactive role in really trying to ensure housing for everyone. So I went a little bit more than 10 minutes, but
It was
also feels
awesome.
like there's a
Yeah.
lot to be said about this. I want to maybe just pause there and see what direction people would be interested in going.
Yeah.
What kind of, your own perspectives and thoughts are on this.
Thank you. You included so many more things that I wasn't quite expecting. It's awesome. Definitely informative to me. And so I'm going to open it up to questions for those who are new here. I'm happy to explain later what Wellbeing Economy Alliance is. And we prefer people come on camera if they're able to and ask their own questions. Just ideally, it's a question as opposed to an explanation of what project you're working on or something like that, and try and keep everybody to one question until enough people have had a chance to go that we could do a second round. So, who's got a question related to Zach's presentation? Ruthie, go for it.
Thank you, Zach. That was great. I'm wondering, the Vienna model that you showed, can you describe what kind of conditions they have to make that kind of a use of a social housing so prevalent there?
Yeah,
Like,
well,
is it?
I mean, yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's sort of the danger or challenge of trying to say like, hey, there's this model over here. We can just like directly transplant that and plop it down on our completely different conditions. Vienna went through this really sort of, sort of like social revolutionary period in the early 1900s that resulted in this essentially like socialist party moving in and then doing a lot of work to essentially go after land speculation there and really drove down the cost of land. And by doing so, we're able to kind of like then bring in a lot of land and housing into the public domain. And then sort of built up this social housing sector again for the past, over 100 years. And that social housing has been like the mainstay of that political party's agenda for the past 100 years and have remained I mean, I think there's a lot to be learned sort of in terms of building a durable political coalition, but they have remained in power with that being their, main sort of flagship political program. But it also goes alongside a whole bunch of other, like a much stronger social safety net than we have here, which I think is a very challenging part of sort of working on any sector where like, you know, housing alone does not necessarily address the like broad range of other needs that people have. I think it's an important like part of those sort of like basic needs that we have. But, when you look at some of these other places that have a much stronger social safety net, it doesn't then go like fall on the housing service providers to like do all these other things, what like we do sometimes have right now, especially when we think about certain types of permanently supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness, all these other things that like really require a huge number of additional services because we have such a sort of skimpy social safety net that should be able to provide a lot of those other things.
Cool. Thank you.
Ruthie, I'm just curious before you mute. Were you referring to the conditions of the property itself? Like, for example, okay, great. Thanks. Carl.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Doc. Kind of a question, kind of a drawing a position that some people here maybe have heard me mention before. Zach, are you familiar with Village Homes in Davis, California?
I'm not.
It's this year a 50-year-old development. First of all, I'm an architect and a large advocate for what I call deep green art design, which is not LEED certification, which I'm getting more more militant about. But Village Homes represents um, thinking from the 70s that continues to provide or to produce buildings and developments that are um, cost less to build than conventional, not green, conventional building, and should be a very important part of affordable housing because if you make a building that heats and cools itself, the lifetime costs of energy and upkeep is much reduced. So village homes, as some people would consider, is perhaps the greenest development in modern history. It's cost less to build. The houses have used 50% less energy for over 50 years and is extremely resilient. It's in Davis, California. I could happy to share some more information with you, but it's a tremendously important model for building affordably and resilient. Um, for like specifically long-term affordability to me means building houses that are energy efficient. I don't mean solar panels. I mean working with nature. And so anyway, so passive solar design and or particularly village homes, which incorporates that with kind of a larger vision of stormwater capture, food forests, is many lessons on how to build affordable, resilient for less. And if that's not part of the social housing, I don't know. I don't really understand what social green housing is. So,
Carl, would
more
you
of a
share
statement.
a link to Village Homes in the chat?
I will.
Okay.
And Zach, and I've talked to other advocates for affordable housing, and they seem to buy into um, certification, lead, things that cost 15% more to build than just less to build. So I advocate less to build, more resilient, more efficient, and that's where I'd like to advocate green social housing can go.
Yeah.
And there are good examples.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Carl. Thanks. And I appreciate the pointing to, I think those types of like case studies and examples are really powerful in sort of showing people how an alternative ways of doing things. I know sometimes things like lead certification end up because they become a certain standard that's like recognized by the industry or whatever,
Yeah, and
they can
as
get
I
sort
said,
of certain
I,
like funding incentives to go in that direction. But I think there's lots of other yeah, interesting ways to approach that. I think, as you said, are pointing to like both at the individual home level of thinking about energy efficiency and sort of passive ways of building homes
yeah,
to just be more efficient, in addition to more of like the community scale resilience and other measures, is a really important part of thinking about this, which again, I think goes helps to think about beyond just like what single building or single home, but like how you kind of build that ecologically
just
sustainable.
just to put a number on it, the best lead building is 35% better than baseline normal. Most of them are 0 to 12% better than normal. A good passive building is at least 50% better than normal. Some are 80% better than normal
Yeah.
that do not cost more to build. So that to me, this is maybe with some information about public comment. Um,
Yeah, I think
could
that would be a great thing to add. And one thing that I think, and maybe I'm a little bit less familiar with these kinds of sort of like design standards and specifications. I do know in Seattle, they recently passed this essentially millionaire's tax. It's an employer's tax on compensation over $1 million to fund a social housing developer at the city level. It's actually really incredible, like one of these sort of like really awesome victories in the past 6 months amidst like a bunch of like obviously really, I think, terrible and otherwise very oppressive and scary things happening, showing this very like popular support for this both this vision and this idea and like progressive revenue measures. I think that it won by like 20 something points, like kind of like this like huge blow away victory. And one of the things they included was a passive house standard as being a required part of all the developments that they do for that.
I'm
Which
sorry.
might be different.
I'm not talking about passive house.
Carl, would it be okay if someone else is able to
Yeah, I think
question?
I'm not trying to
Let's.
say that
I'd
that's
love
what
to,
you're
I'd love to
talking
follow
about.
up with, but these are I just have some clear like things cost less and can be better. I'd love to chat and share some information with you.
Yeah, maybe
Sure.
the
I
two of
think
you
just sort of
can.
indicating the ways that you can sort of like try to think alternatively about different types of design, again, for the public benefit with this.
Yes.
Great. So, Dr. Chowdhury, I think maybe you started to raise your hand, and or it might have been accidental. But if you have a question, please let me know. Anyone else have a question? Okay, Rochelle.
Hey, so how far away are we? I would love the link to the commentary. I guess they're looking for public commentary. And so it's like how far away are we from implementing some sort of structure like this into modern society? Like have there already been asks and kind of like what may the hindrances be toward getting there?
Yeah, so as I said, I think there's interesting models that are starting to emerge in different parts of the US. Seattle, again, I mentioned, just sort of created this social housing developer for the city. Chicago also just a few months ago passed a green social housing ordinance that creates a public developer for the city. There's a bunch of other campaigns in other parts of the country. In Los Angeles, um, they passed a measure called ULA a few years ago. That's a transfer tax on mansions, essentially being bought and sold, that goes in to fund a whole range of different housing issues. But one of those is sort of this set aside for, they don't call it social housing, but essentially is this type of idea of decommodified housing. So that's starting to be implemented right now as we speak. But I think, yeah, this is sort of like a growing model that's popping up in some places, and that can hopefully help like seed and encourage like bigger and like more at scale versions of this to happen in California. I think a number of things would have to change. I mean, ultimately, like a lot of things we were talking about, it's like a political challenge. It's a challenge of like how you allocate funding in the budget, and people's belief in doing something different than the status quo. This particular bill, Senate Bill 555, it's like not that exciting because it's a study bill, but I think for us is trying to lay the groundwork for like making this feel more real for the legislature at the state level, for a whole bunch of different stakeholders who are starting to think about this more seriously. And then, I think like we have a governor's race next year. People are like, there was a recent poll that showed housing as far and away the number one issue in California, more than double the like next thing for people's top issue. I think people are going to be thinking about what is their sort of ambitious housing agenda going to be to really sort of try to tackle this at scale. And I think this is like one sort of important component of that could be a part of someone's agenda. But as we also see, there's lots of things that are lots of political headwinds. I would say lots of things sort of working against us at both the national level, um, and yeah, and I think and also within the state. So by no means is this something that's like this is like definitely happening. Trying to build some of that momentum and have conversations like this, one-on-one conversations, talking to our neighbors and families about the housing experiences and impacts that they're sort of seeing, and trying to see what it would look like to, organize around something different.
Thanks. Who else has a question? I know Ruthie's got another one, but just want to make sure anyone who hasn't gone yet gets a chance. All right, Ruthie, you're up, and then I'm going to go after you. I've got one. So,
Okay, thanks. I was just wondering, I know there's a lot of talk about the missing middle housing, so people that make maybe like 80 to 120% of like the medium income. So I was just wanting to see, I know social housing isn't necessarily kind of like maybe it's a part of affordable housing conversation, but not the entirety. So I don't know if I was just thinking, is there a case to make that this kind of social housing would just help increase affordable housing within cities, across the kind of lower income and middle income people that are being priced out of cities as well?
Yeah, thanks, Ruthie. Yeah, the sort of missing middle, sometimes called workforce housing, but is yeah, and I think an important part, like if you look at the sort of projections and statistics of housing need across the state, there's like a deep need at the lowest income levels, but it's really across the spectrum. Um, and you didn't go into this as part of a very quick presentation. But one sort of key aspect that people sort of typically understand as a part of the social housing model is that it is available to a pretty wide range of incomes within SB 555 that goes up to 120% of area median income. Some models also like include market rate housing as part of this, but which is to say, in contrast to like what has been typically understood as public housing in the United States, which is only reserved for like the very poorest people. And we sort of see the ways that that is very easily eroded and kind of dismantled, and sort of in some ways set up to fail without the like political commitment to it because it cannot sustain itself without ongoing subsidy. So as soon as you defund it, it like the buildings fall apart, which is essentially what's happened with public housing through this sort of like long defunding and dismantling process over the past 70, 80 years. Um, and so a lot of models for social housing essentially allow for both like higher incomes and lower income units across the portfolio of housing, which allows for sort of ongoing revenue that can help sustain the entire system as a whole. And as you sort of point out, it also allows us to be producing that kind of like missing middle or workforce housing, but still being committed to affordability. So people who still live there are still paying affordable rents. And we're still sort of committed in a long-term way as not being like eventually sold for some exorbitant amount of money, but like maintained permanently in sort of public or community trust. So I think it also helps like build that broader like political constituency of people. So it's like not just the poorest people, but a broad range of people who could see themselves living in some form of social housing. I'll also just say like social housing in lots of parts of the world also have sort of a wonky term, but it's called like mixed tenure, which is to say it's not just people who rent, but there's also like versions of home ownership within social housing, so people actually can like purchase their unit and have some equity and usually get some like limited profit if they resell it at some point. This is how a lot of limited equity co-ops work currently in California, but which is all of which is to say allows for like a wide range of like different specific models and different specific people who can access it, which hopefully creates a more like durable political constituency than you might have with just sort of like these programs that are very means tested for only the sort of poorest people.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
So I've got a couple questions, but I'll just do one to see who else might have one. So you mentioned political will. Obviously, money is part of this as well. The purchasing of the land and the property and building. But I'm just wondering, what are some of the other top three obstacles that might be out there, like finding the land, NIMBY, or the whole abundance agenda that the regulations are too hard, and but what do you see as the three obstacles to having more of this in California besides politics?
Besides politics. Yeah, well, so we could talk about some of the like NIMBY, YIMBY, abundant stuff if people want to. I think I mean, that's just another sort of political question, policy question of what are the sort of like mechanisms we have in place that allow for good governance or direct markets to do what we want them to do. Um, I think like it's also a political issue. I think it the sort of vast amount of inequality we have in the country is like just generally a challenge for all of these things. It goes back to, I think, a question I think Ruthie had at the very beginning of sort of the difference between here and Vienna. Again, I think that like those as the social conditions we have make it really hard to like sort of like uh just build housing that meets all of those disparate needs because it's so vast, like the inequality we have in this country. So like putting that on the housing system to solve on itself again, I think is just like almost a near impossible task. Um, and needs to be like addressed in a whole bunch of other different ways. So I think, yeah, I think that's a general challenge. The other thing, which again is a political issue, is like I mean, this is true, I think, as we think about the climate crisis as well and responding to that collectively. But people sort of talk about how we are sort of experiencing a deep need for like really big collective, we are experiencing these huge collective action problems, which I think of as like climate and like housing, where we need to really move collectively. And that's in the shadow of this decades long program of what's like typically called neoliberalism, but essentially the like hollowing out of our public institutions, which really has mean that we've like relegated a lot of that work to the private sector. And again, private sector can be very good at doing certain things, but for these types of collective action problems that are not so easily motivated by like profit incentives and market signals, it's really hard to think that you're going to have markets directed in the right way to address them. But our public institutions don't really have the capacity and expertise, and they have so little trust from the public to be able to accomplish those things that I think it's really hard to sort of stand up some of these institutions like overnight to address these huge social problems. So it's sort of like it requires these sort of stepping stones for us to sort of like start building that muscle back up so that we can start to do more and more of these things in ways that like gain trust, gain actual like results, like you can sort of demonstrate impact and be able to like in a relatively urgent and rapid time frame start to actually like meaningfully shift things at a sort of high structural level. I think again the same thing about a lot of the challenges we face in addressing the climate crisis, where like we've seen a lot of production or a lot of really good shifts in like clean energy becoming more cost efficient, but like relying on the market alone to just do that is not gonna get us at the scale and speed that we need to really prevent the worst levels um, of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. So it really requires like really strong and yeah, I think public action. And I think that's a huge sort of like structural issue that we're up against. I'm not sure if this is really getting exactly to your question, David, but are the sort of
It's
some of the
it's a
general
good
things.
starting point, and if there's more time, I'll have a follow up. But
Okay.
gonna let some up. But thank you, Jorge. Good to see you, Sarah.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Zach. It was a very interesting presentation. I have actually, it's a double question, if David allows me. One, if you can define for us what you mean by housing as a human right. And then if you can explain how your coalition works with the other organizations, how do they structure, how do they participate, how do they govern?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. Um, I mean, I think we sort of use housing as a human right as more of like a narrative thing, which is to say, like, we believe everyone deserves housing as like a basic need and that it's a sort of basic responsibility and obligation of society to provide that to everyone. I think there's sort of a legal framework that people understand, like rights and sort of um, what rights entail, and then there's a sort of whole other, you know, again, sort of legal conversation about how people are able to then what options they have for kind of like holding institutions accountable for failing to provide things that are rights. But I think we just sort of use that to say like in the same way that people I think have often on a national level talked about healthcare as a human right. In really trying to make the call for providing some like national health insurance program. Um, Similarly, have sort of tried to use that to say like we all understand that everyone needs housing in order to survive. This is something we have as a basic obligation to each other, and we need to make sure that we are not just like leaving this up to like whether you can happen to afford it or not, but something we need to be able to provide to everyone. For the coalition,
Zach,
yeah,
can I just add something to that real quick? I believe, I don't know if it's a UN compact, but there is something where it actually says it, and the US has signed into the charter that housing is a basic right. I'll have to try and get the language on that. But
yeah, and there actually was efforts in the past few years to try to make a constitutional amendment in California to define housing as a human right. There's a couple countries that have that defined as part of their legal framework. Like I think in like Scotland they have that, which I guess is part of the UK, but that's whatever its own country. So yeah, there's a couple other places that have sort of have that, but it's a little bit vague as to like what actually putting that in as like a constitutional right then entails. But yeah, there is sort of this like rights-based framework that is like understood in both like the international and like subnational uh legal world, judicial world. But here I think we often are sort of using it more in a narrative way. Um so, and for the coalition, very briefly, yeah, we have sort of essentially a broader coalition membership structure that organizations can join. And then we have like different working groups. And as I said, we have the steering committee that makes a lot of the sort of strategic decisions for the coalition that are then advanced in any number of different ways through different working groups that coalition members participate in. We do also do like some coalition-wide votes on certain things, like our legislative endorsements and stuff like that. So there's other kind of ways that we, yeah, have broader input from the coalition on some of our decision making.
I was
So
actually
what,
a
what's
similar.
the
Oh, go ahead,
benefit?
Jorge.
What's the benefit of being for the members? Why they join?
Yeah, I mean, what's the benefit of being a part of this call? I think it's essentially like it's an organizing challenge to say, I think everyone recognizes that like each organization individually isn't able to advance and win on the things they care about. And a lot of our organizations, again, work at the local level, but realize that things that they need to win are happen at jurisdictions bigger than that. So it's an opportunity both to like learn, sort of share information, but I think more importantly to try to organize together and like understand that the issues we're facing in LA are similar to the ones we're facing in Fresno, are similar to the ones we're facing in Bakersfield, along the Central Coast, et cetera, wherever you happen to be, and to be able to work on those collectively to advance some statewide goals.
Yeah, I've been on some of the calls. It's an amazing group of people who are really talented. They're very activist oriented and trying to create change and very knowledgeable about all their fields. And so it feels very open and, contribute what you want, participate when you want. And I was just curious, my question was more going to be for people who are interested in joining, what are sort of the requirements to join the California Green New Deal?
Yeah, so right now as a coalition, we're sort of like an organization of organizations. So generally, we don't have like individuals sort of join just on themselves. Um, so if you have an organization that you work for that would be interested, or even if it's not like a formal organization, even like volunteer-based groups, but we're sort of like looking for some form of organizational structure and not individuals. There is a form that people can fill out to sort of like apply to join the coalition. It essentially means like agreeing to certain environmental justice principles and following the leadership of the steering committee that we have. There's like some sort of orientation conversation that I or someone will have with people that apply. And then there's like a process through which the steering committee essentially like reviews and approves new members. Relatively low lift. But if people are interested, I'm happy to share more of that.
Great. Well, I'll ask my follow-up question to the last question I asked, which is, how much of a challenge is it to get land for these social housing projects? Is there space? Is it the problem with space? Is it the problem of affording it or needing to wait till there's a large enough plot? So,
Yeah, I mean, land's definitely one component of things. It definitely depends like where you are talking about. I think often in terms of new construction or production of housing, the construction costs are much higher than like the costs of land. So,
mm,
but I think especially we're thinking about places like LA. One thing that I think has been interesting to see with the money that they have from ULA is because, in part due to fairly exclusionary zoning in LA that only allows for single family homes in certain parts of the city, the available land that they have to build on is often also like very polluted, like either very close to like active oil wells or otherwise kind of contaminated by various industrial uses. So, like, there's some land, but it's like really not healthy to actually build on and require a bunch of like remediation and cleanup. Um, in other parts of the state, we like see people increasingly building housing into what's sometimes called the like wildlife urban interface, but into like more green spaces, which I think is not great for a variety of reasons, often because they are also like at much higher risk of things like wildfires, and also leads to a lot of like sprawl and making these for like vast commutes. We see this for anyone in the Bay Area with like these sort of super commuters that are driving hours and hours each way to get to and from work. So, I think there's like it's not like there's not land out there to build on, but I do think there's a question of like whether it's actually safe to be building on a lot of it. And you know, if we are going to build in a place, make sure there's actually like the services and like broader kind of community resilience measures we would need in order to like actually make those affordable and healthy places to live.
so I see Carl's got a question. Just want to make sure anyone who hasn't gone yet gets a chance. If you have a question, Carl, go for it.
Well, I already just put in the chat. Is there a clearly I have some passion and expertise and experience in that's outside of the normal architectural green thinking. But my question was, is there a group that's specifically about retrofitting existing buildings to be more energy efficient, more to make them more habitable?
Yeah, definitely. There's a number of both state and local programs that try to do both sort of energy efficiency and decarbonization retrofits. One of the big programs that we helped to advocate for and are now in the process of like trying to support with implementation is something called the Equitable Building Decarbonization Program, which is around $500 million at the state level to fund whole home retrofits. Um, so that's, I mean, the cost of retrofitting homes is going to be substantial. But I think trying to think about it from a whole home perspective, which seems like you have a lot of expertise and thoughts about as well. But rather than just trying to do like single appliance switching, which a lot of other programs are kind of geared towards, which is like you get a rebate if you switch out your or
Yeah.
your gas
Well,
stove for an induction stove, et cetera,
what
et cetera.
I'm really asking is there a group like an advocacy group that might be interested in like thinking about this issue more holistically?
Oh, sure.
Because actually the things that you just mentioned is another example of green think that costs more money, and there's ways to do this without costing more money. And
Yeah, I
and
mean,
that,
there's
so
definitely a
there's
lot of. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
anyway, but that's so this I'm not really interested in like a some sort of policy or legislative action, but like a group that's interested in these questions.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different groups that work on energy efficiency. In
Because you earlier mentioned there's a number of list of people of groups that we could reach out to. So
Sure, yeah. I'm
perhaps you could share
happy
that
to
with David.
maybe sure, yeah, we can follow up and see if there's other. I mean, yeah, it's sort of like a broad range of probably like smaller groups to groups that like do this in terms of implementation to like much more institutionalized groups that do this kind of work. But it's definitely a big question right now of what like how we make our homes more energy efficient, both from like again a cost or affordability perspective, but also a sort of design and
Well, but also like not just more energy efficient, but more livable. Like so, like I made a comment that like so that people can stay in their houses during heat waves without power. So there's a really deeper social component to thinking about this more
yeah, totally.
holistically.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Also, likewise, a lot of people. I mean, one thing, again, it's a little bit more on the policy side. So it's not what exactly what you're talking about, but there's a big push around sort of like trying to think about indoor air temperature in the context of extreme heat, where right now there is no requirements around cooling, but we have like requirements around heating. Like if you're going to rent your home, you have to provide heating above a certain temperature. That's sort of a basic understanding, but we don't do the same around cooling, and with increasingly sort of heat waves and increasing temperatures. That's been like a major question. And I think likewise, sort of on some of the things you're talking about in terms of resilience, a lot of conversations around things like microgrids, allowing for people's homes to stay both like cool and healthy when like power gets shut off, especially in like PG&E territory. We've seen a bunch of power shutoffs over the past several years. So a lot of people thinking about that for a variety of different, especially vulnerable populations.
I mean, if you're
Um,
interested in this, like another great lesson from Village Homes is people live there without air conditioning through the summer. It's
Yeah.
which is pretty impressive for Davis, California. And so this is like there's ways to do this more cost effectively, both like the cost of doing it and the ecological cost and the over long-term cost. And that's kind of where I'm centered.
oh, yeah, definitely.
So,
Um,
Carl, maybe I'll reach out. I was telling Zach I was debating doing a housing series next year, but we haven't figured out if we're going to do it or not. But maybe we could do a feature on the types of things, the construction, design, and village homes. So,
yeah,
but it's sort of
yeah,
on.
I'm happy to. I'm sorry, I'm just like there's a way to do this so that I would say that there's a way to do this at half the cost that most buildings between 30 to 40 miles of the coast can be retrofitted, then not need air conditioning, provide thermal comfort.
Yeah,
That's that's cost effective, and that saves money for the state, saves money for everybody, and allows people to stay independent during no power,
right.
your power outages. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Yeah. Well, a couple
So,
things before we wrap up. So everybody filled out a poll when you were coming in. I thought I'd share the results of it. The biggest interest was in community ownership of land. Uh, Second was what does affordability really mean? And then tied for third was the complication of lowering home prices and sustainable building. So that's what people are interested from all the people who signed up in the future. But Zach, thank you so much for coming and for sharing all the knowledge. And I mean, you just do such a great job of leading the network and coalition that you do, and got so many great groups involved. So thank you for letting us be part of that. Are there any final thoughts or ways we could support your work?
Yeah, so a
public
couple quick things, just things I mentioned. I just put the public comment portal in the chat. I can also follow up with people. We also have sort of a talking points guide for people that want to go a little bit deeper. Again, it's not supposed to be like just say this, but yeah, provide a little bit more context both to like how to think about some of the questions around the definition. I'll also just put my email in the chat. People should feel more than free to reach out anytime. I'll do my best to respond in a timely manner. But yeah, just appreciate the chance to share a little bit and hear both some of your perspectives and questions. And happy to continue. And if there's more parts of the housing series in this particular group and formation, would be interested in learning more and attending, and hopefully we'll see you all then.
All right. Terrific. Thank you again, Zach. I'm going to stop recording, but give him a quick round of applause before we stop. And